The dust had a way of settling deep into everything in the Arizona territory, coating the rough-sawn planks of Elias Kincaid's shack, the leather of his saddle, and the very soul of the man himself. Elias was what they called a struggling rancher, which was a polite way of saying he was stubborn and poor. His wealth was measured not in cattle, he had barely 24 scrawny heads, but in the desolate, unyielding land he claimed, a stretch of cracked earth that ran perilously close to the Apache wilderness. He lived by simple rules: stay out of trouble, keep your head down, and never, under any circumstances, cross the invisible line that separated his world from the ancient, fiercely protected world of the Apache people. That line, he knew, was not just dirt, it was blood. It was late afternoon, the sun a brutal, copper orb beginning its descent, when Elias found her. He was checking a broken section of barbed wire fence, a futile task, given the vastness of the prairie, when he noticed a disruption in the sparse brush, a broken piece of pottery, and then, the silhouette of a woman slumped against a sandstone outcrop. She was Apache, dressed in traditional buckskin, and injured. A quick, practiced glance told him the injury was to her leg, a deep, ragged gash that had bled profusely, soaking the dry earth dark. Her face was a mask of pain and exhaustion, but her eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian chips, met his with a defiance that defied her weakness. The first, instinctive thought that slammed into Elias's mind was not compassion, but fear. This was death walking. A white man caught aiding a hostile Indian woman, or worse, one belonging to the fiercely independent bands that roamed these mountains, would be lucky to hang quickly. If the army found out, they'd call it treason. If the neighboring ranchers found out, they'd call it justice and deliver it themselves. And if her people who had been at war with his for generations, whose very name struck terror into the settlements, found her here, they would see his act not as help, but as capture, and they would leave nothing of Elias Kincaid but ashes and bone. He could ride away. He should ride away. The choice was clear, logical, and dictated by every law of the territory. But Elias was a man who, despite his poverty, lived by the unseen law of humanity. He looked not at the hostile Apache, the enemy, the danger, but at a woman in terrible pain, bleeding out under the unforgiving Arizona sun. He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands wide and visible. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, his voice rough and low, the words feeling futile in the silent wilderness. Her eyes narrowed, but she did not move or cry out. She was too proud, too weary. Elias approached with the measured caution of a man dealing with a wounded mountain lion. He saw the crude splint she tried to fashion, the desperation of her journey. He reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a clean strip of linen, a shirt he never wore, and his canteen. He knelt, ignoring the scorching glare she fixed upon him. He cleaned the wound, bandaged it tightly, and helped her drink, offering the water first, knowing that in this land, water was the ultimate sign of intent. He worked with a quiet, efficient urgency that bypassed the need for trust. When he was done, he looked at her. "I can't leave you here. Son'll finish the job, and the coyotes will follow." He knew the risk of taking her back to his shack was insane, but leaving her was unthinkable. It was a moral boundary crossed, an act that had nothing to do with cattle or land, but with the courage to acknowledge another human life. He carefully helped her onto his horse, securing her with a rope, not to bind her, but to keep her from falling. The woman, whose name he would later learn was Nalin, offered no resistance, only a silent acceptance of his reckless mercy. For 3 days, Nalin lay in Elias's spare cot, her leg throbbing, her fever cycling through the scorching heat and shivering cold. Elias tended to her with a patience he didn't know he possessed. He fetched cool water from the well, changed the dressings, and fed her broth made from his meager stores. They communicated in the shared language of pain and care, gestures, glances, and a silence that slowly stripped away the decades of war and hate that separated their worlds. Nalin never spoke of her people, where she came from, or how she was injured. Elias never asked. He only saw her as a guest, a patient, and a tremendous, terrifying secret. On the third day, the fever broke. Nalin was lucid, her eyes clear and assessing. She watched Elias constantly, how he moved, how he worked, how he ate, how he treated his dog, how he talked to his horse. She was studying his character, weighing his humanity against the color of his skin. Finally, she spoke, her voice a low, gravelly whisper in a language Elias barely understood. "You risk much." "Why?" Elias, mending a saddle strap, shrugged, uncomfortable with the question. "Just, seemed like the right thing to do. Can't leave a soul to die in the sand." Nalin considered this, her expression unreadable. She spoke a few more words, more clearly now, pointing east towards the mountains. "My people. They come for me." The words were not a threat, but a simple statement of fact. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He knew what that meant. They would track her. And they would find her here, in the home of a white man. He looked out the window. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and blood red. "When?" he asked, his voice barely a breath. "Dawn," she whispered. "They follow the stars. They arrive with the light. Dawn. A few hours away." Elias had time to pack, to take his horse and ride hard for the nearest fort, 30 miles away. He could leave Nalin, let her people find her safe, and save his own life. It was the second clear, logical choice fate had offered him. But he had already crossed the line. He couldn't leave her, not after 3 days of quiet trust, not after bandaging her wounds with his own hands. And to ride away now would be to admit that his kindness had limits, that his humanity was conditional. He made the third, final, and most reckless choice of his life. He would stay. He would face them. He spent the next hour preparing, not for a fight, but for a meeting. He hid his rifle, he would not meet them armed. He laid out his few possessions, his meager food, his worn Bible, a handful of coins. He wanted them to see everything, to see a man with nothing to hide, a man who truly had nothing to offer but mercy. He sat on his porch swing, the air growing cool, and watched the stars wheel overhead, waiting for a dawn that might be his last. He didn't sleep. He sat and watched the black silhouette of the mountains, imagining the silent approach of the Apache riders. His heart hammered a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against his ribs, but strangely, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had done the right thing. Whatever came next was his destiny. The sky began to pale, the first streaks of pale gold bleeding over the eastern peaks. Elias squinted. And then he saw them. Not a raiding party, not a scouting group. A vast, silent tide of mounted warriors. Hundreds. 1,000, perhaps. The entire nation, or a significant portion of it, seemed to be riding toward his small, insignificant shack. They were silhouettes against the rising sun, majestic, terrifying, and utterly silent. He gripped the edge of the swing until his knuckles were white. Nalin hobbled out onto the porch, leaning heavily on a wooden crutch he had fashioned for her. She stood beside him, her gaze fixed on her approaching people. Elias took a deep breath, standing tall. He was a poor man, a humble rancher, but he would not cower. He would meet them standing. The riders stopped 100 yards from the shack. A motionless, overwhelming wall of men and horses. The silence was deafening, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic, shallow breaths of Elias Kincaid. Then, a single rider, clearly the leader, adorned with an elaborate headdress, advanced slowly, halting 20 feet from the porch. He was an imposing figure, his face stern and his eyes holding the weight of his people's history. Nalin spoke, a torrent of sharp, guttural Apache that Elias could not follow, yet he felt the force of her conviction. She spoke for several long minutes, gesturing toward the wound on her leg, then to Elias, and finally toward the barren ground, emphasizing the shared humanity of their situation. The leader listened, his expression unwavering. When Nalin finished, the silence returned, heavier and more dangerous than before. The leader turned his formidable gaze upon Elias. He said something in Apache, a single word, sharp and interrogative. Elias held his gaze. "I saved her life," Elias said, his voice surprisingly steady, though his tongue felt thick and dry. "She was hurt. I gave her water and shelter. Nothing more." The leader spoke again, this time pointing at the rifle rack inside the shack, visible through the open doorway. "I left my gun," Elias stated simply, "because I don't want to fight." The leader dismounted, a gesture of profound gravity. He walked slowly toward the porch, stopping right at the edge. He looked at Nalin, then back at Elias, his eyes piercing. He reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out a small, intricately carved stone amulet. He did not offer it. He held it out, open in his palm. "Life," the leader said, speaking a single, broken word of English. "You gave life. We do not forget." He then turned to Nalin and spoke to her, a long, rapid stream of Apache. Nalin nodded, her obsidian eyes meeting Elias's with an expression that was softer than he had ever seen it. The leader then stepped back, turned to his people, and raised a hand. In a gesture that defied everything Elias had ever known about the frontier, the entire host of warriors slowly, silently, turned their horses and began to ride away, dissolving back into the rising sun and the vast, empty landscape from which they had emerged. They left as silently as they had come, leaving behind only the dust they raised and the stunned, profound silence. Elias stood there, rooted to the porch, watching until the last silhouette vanished. The dawn had changed everything. His act of mercy, the simple courage to do what was right when no one was watching, had not brought war, but a strange, terrifying peace. He was still a poor rancher with a broken fence and 24 scrawny cattle, but he now possessed a wealth beyond measure, the honor of an entire nation, and a destiny forever bound by one act of simple kindness. He looked down at Nalin, who was watching him with a knowing, gentle expression. "They spared us," he finally managed to whisper. Nalin only smiled, a rare, breathtaking sight. "No," she said, her voice stronger now. "They honored us. Now you have two worlds watching you, Elias Kincaid. Live with it."